welcome back to my channel. My name is Jordan and today I'm going to be talking about some of the books that I've read recently. Now I did a poll on Twitter and on YouTube to see if you guys wanted me to do a few dedicated reviews or if you wanted me to do this, and I got different answers from both, so I am going to do both. I did the Scythe review already and now I'm just going to talk about the other books that I've read recently that I didn't necessarily have as much to say about to dedicate a whole review towards, but I'd still like to discuss them, so here we go. Let's dive in. So the first one that I'm going to talk about is Alanna, the First Adventure by Tamara Pierce. So this book follows Alanna, who is a young noble, and she and her twin brother are basically of age to be sent to be trained. Her brother is going to go to the castle to become a knight, and she's going to go to basically a kind of nunnery of sorts, and she's going to learn magic. But unfortunately, she hates magic, and her brother hates fighting, so she basically decides, because they look so similar, that they should swap and that she should pretend to be a guy and go to the castle and he should be trained by the nuns to use magic. So that's what they do. She forges her father's letter and unbeknownst to her father, she heads to the castle to train like a knight. And basically this follows her trials and tribulations at the castle as she trains. And I think that it's a fair start to a series. It's not the most exciting, but it does have some really fun elements and I think it sets up for other books pretty well. Now, this book was gifted to me for Christmas from a good friend of mine, and while I did enjoy it, I didn't love it. I gave it a 3.5 stars out of 5, and I just thought that in a lot of ways it showed potential for the rest of the series, but it didn't blow me away by any standards. And I think that that's because it's meant for a younger audience, and I would have enjoyed it a lot more had I read it originally when I was, you know, in middle grade kind of age. So Alanna isn't the most compelling protagonist ever. She doesn't really evolve much throughout the book, and she doesn't make the people around her evolve either, which is what is required of a flat arc. I do understand that it's only the first in a series, and I'm sure she grows and evolves throughout the other books, but I prefer stories where development happens throughout all of the books. That being said, I do like Alanna. She's got grit and determination, which, you know, makes it for an enjoyable read. I do feel like more of her backstory could have been delved into though, as it's not really clear why she doesn't like magic, and there are a few things that just didn't make complete sense. I do like the world in this book, as I love medieval fantasy, but I feel like the magic system definitely could have been clearer. It didn't impede my enjoyment, but I think the magic sequences could have been strengthened by a better understanding of the rules so that we understood Elena and, you know, her companions' limitations. What I do like is the added element of the gods into the magic system, as I feel it adds a level of unpredictability that sways the course of the book, especially because these are sentient beings of sort, so it adds a level of intrigue for sure. What I really do like is a lot of the side characters in this book, and if I read on, which I think I might read the next book in the series, I think I'll like them even more. There is a lot of strong personalities that are introduced, including some of the teachers and a lot of Alanna's classmates. That being said, I'd love to know more about Alanna's twin, who she's separate from, but I feel like that's something that we'll get to know more about in future books because now they're finally able to send letters to each other. One of the weaker elements to me is the villainous cousin of the prince who serves as one of the main antagonists in the story. He just wasn't set up very well, and I feel like he would have been much scarier if we had been shown how villainous he was rather than Alanna saying, I don't know why, but this man just gives me like really bad vibes. The writing in the story is a little bit young, but that's to be expected of a middle grade book, so that didn't bother me too much as I went into it knowing what it was going to be like. But what I didn't really like were the dream and action sequences. I thought these could have used a lot more clarity, and they weren't as exciting and compelling as they should have been, especially as some of the most important scenes in the entire book. Like, in some of them, I barely knew what was happening. Basically, to sum it up, I enjoyed the book while I read it, and I do think that the series has some potential, but I didn't love it and it didn't blow me away. I would definitely recommend it to middle grade readers and people who are new to the fantasy genre, as I feel like it's a good introduction to that kind of thing, but for people who are well versed in fantasy, it's going to seem a little bit basic and a little bit cliche. Next up, I'm going to talk about Radio Silence, which I read with Cindy from Read with Cindy and Kat from Paperback Dreams for our book club Paper Cut, and we just had the live show on Kat's channel, so you can check that out. I will leave that in the description. If you have read the book and, you know, want to hear our thoughts thoughts and opinions on it, so I'm not going to delve too deep into it here. But for those of you who haven't read it, I'm going to do a quick non-spoiler review so that I can give you my thoughts. So this book follows Frances Janvier, and I'm pretty sure that's how you pronounce her last name, but not 100%, who is basically the British equivalent of a senior in high school. She is a great student who's applying to one of the top universities in England, but she kind of feels isolated and like people don't really know her at school, but she allows herself to be weird outside of school as a fan artist for a podcast that she absolutely adores. She finds out that this podcast is run by one of her neighbors, and she's like its #1 fan, and they start collaborating. But I think I'm gonna end the synopsis there because I don't really know how much to give away in stories like this. So basically it's her relationship with her neighbor as they create this podcast and do other things. And yeah, I really like this book, and I think that's largely to do with the characters. All of them are really unique and compelling, and I think really nuanced, so it adds a level of realism to coming-of-age contemporaries that is necessary, in my opinion. It also makes the relationships between the characters seem very real. The messages and themes throughout the book are also very strong and I think quite relatable. While I think you might get the most of reading this book while you're in your final year of high school, I also think that the fear of not knowing if you're pursuing the right path is widely experienced, and therefore I think that people of any age and at any point in their life might be able to find elements that they can identify with in this story. Some of the plot elements are where I think this story is the weakest and why I rated it a 4 stars instead of a 5 stars. For example, the climax I feel like is a little bit contrived and a little over the top, and I feel like the ending is a little bit too clean for the level of realism that we've come to expect from the rest of the story. That being said, I think it's a really great book and I would definitely recommend it, and that says a lot because I don't usually read contemporaries and I don't usually identify with contemporaries as much as I did with this one. I think it's also a great representation of internet culture in a lot of ways, which is really hard to achieve, I think, in young adult literature. It doesn't come across as like trying to be cool and hip and, you know, fit into the internet culture, and I think that has a lot to do with the fact that Alice Oseman is young and is a YouTuber, so she really understands the culture of the internet and some of its pitfalls and some of its challenges, as well as some of the, you know, great elements to internet and influencer culture, I guess. Okie doke, so the next book that I want to talk about is Scythe by Neil Shusterman. This book has 2 protagonists, Rowan and Citra, and is set in a utopian world, which is a bit dystopian, of course. And basically in this world, there is no famine, no disease, no war, and there's also no death, really. The Thunderhead, which is this huge AI that governs the planet, basically is in control of everything and everyone to a certain extent, and therefore, you know, humans have progressed to the kind of ultimate level that they can go, and no one dies naturally. And basically once you reach a certain age, you just turn back the clock and you can reset yourself to, I think, anything above 25 and above. And so people have reset their clocks, you know, dozens of times and are hundreds of years old at this point, or they can be at least. But because of that, the population is growing exponentially. And so to deal with this, there's basically a group called Scythes who are tasked with gleaning or killing a certain number of the population each year to keep the population under control. Now this group operates outside of the Thunderhead's AI, so basically they are a self-governing force that is tasked to deal with the growth of the, or, you know, keeping the growth of the population under control. I am very conflicted about this book. I'm not entirely sure what to rate it. I have a rating on Goodreads. I don't know if it should be that. I've changed my mind so much about what to rate it. I think it was a 3.5 and then it was a 3. Now it's a 2.5, I'm pretty sure. I don't know. Because there are elements that I really like in it, but for the most part I don't like it. The more time I spend away from it and the more I reflect on it, the more I dislike it. So do with that information what you will. I think a lot of that is because the climax of the book and the ending is fun and flashy, and so I really enjoyed reading that aspect of the book in a kind of, you know, shut your brain off and just embark on the wild ride that is the end of this book, which definitely made me enjoy it quite a bit when I first finished the book, but then the more I reflected on it and compared it to some of the other dystopian novels that I enjoy, the more I realized there was a lot of holes and elements to the plot that were either contradictory to itself or didn't match the internal logic or were just very flawed. Basically, there's a lot of holes in this book, and as a dystopian, one of the main protagonists is the world. So with such a flawed protagonist, I find it very hard to fully enjoy this book, and I think that's why I am slowly rating it less and less, because it's kind of masquerading as a book that's smarter than it really is. The characters in general in this book also felt pretty lackluster to me. Rowan is definitely more interesting than Citra. By the end, he's kind of the most nuanced character, but even then, he's not that nuanced at all. And Citra is just blander than white rice. What I hated most about the both of them, though, was their forced romance. Oh my god, they had less chemistry than Anakin and Padme.
I don't like sand.
I think the book and the emotional connection to the characters and story would have been so much better had it just been a platonic friendship, because it just felt so ridiculously forced. And I know I've said that a few times now, but I just want to reiterate that as many times as possible because it's true. Nearly every other character in this book was either good or evil with little nuance, and I must say that the evil characters were at least a little bit more compelling, and I think that's because the conflict that they created was slightly more topical. But that being said, I feel like the issues were discussed in, at best, a surface level way. In a book that discusses morality so much and, you know, is kind of centered around the idea of human morality, there is very little nuance in the morals of the character, and basically no one is gray. It's good versus bad, which I don't think works in a book about morals. The writing in this book was a bit dry and was kind of boring at the beginning of the book, but I do think that there are some stylistic choices that were really interesting that I enjoyed, and I think that honestly, for a dystopian novel, I kind of like more clear-cut language and not necessarily something super flowery, as the starkness of the writing kind of portrays the starkness of the world. So I didn't mind the style of writing and some of the stylistic choices I actually really enjoyed. But now I think we should talk about some of the holes in the plot and world building and story, and I actually wrote them down so that I don't miss anything. But there's more. These are just the ones that I could come up with in the, like 5 minutes it took for me to think about it. Number 1, why isn't the Thunderhead in charge of the Scythes when really it's in charge of everything else? So it would make sense that it's in charge of the Scythes because it would most definitely be more impartial than humans. It's never actually properly explained why the Scythes are a self-governing force. It's just like, we don't want to trust the AI with that. But like, you're trusting it with everything else, so I don't really see why that is past the capabilities of the Thunderhead and the trust of the Thunderhead when the populace just trusts it wholeheartedly. Another thing is, why aren't people in this book afraid of death? If a certain number of people are being gleaned every year, that means that death is possible, and especially because it is impartial, it's not like if you do, good deeds, then you won't be gleaned. You're just as likely to be gleaned as someone who is, a crappy guy. Because of that, I don't see why you wouldn't be afraid of death. And this is emphasized so much throughout the book that, it's hard for these people who don't die to relate to, the mortal works like Romeo and Juliet and all these other things. They just can't relate to this art because they're not afraid of death. But these people are still dying, so even though it's less likely that you'll die, you're still, you still might be gleaned, and you probably will be gleaned at some point. So I just don't see why, even though that fear might be minimized, why it's so emphasized that these people are not at all afraid of death, because people are still dying. So another one is, why don't people use fire as a way to commit suicide? In the book, fire is the only way that, people can't be brought back. Because that's the other thing. People can be brought back to life if they, jump off a building or literally any other sort of accident. They just go to a recovery center and they get brought back to life. So literally any form of death is reversible except for fire. so I don't understand why the people trying to commit suicide wouldn't just do it by fire. Because basically in the story, it's like, oh yeah, people can't commit suicide anymore. I also feel that it's weird that scythes are allowed to kill the people that they glean in any way that they want. It feels like something that should be standardized, and there's no explanation as to why scythes have the freedom to like use martial arts or poison or weapons or, you know, whatever. They're allowed to do anything, and it just feels like something in this world with this kind of level of technology and uniformity that it would be standardized within the Scythedom. Also, one of the pivotal conflicts in this book is that Citra and Rowan are pitted against each other, and unlike literally any other Scythe's apprentice, one of them will be gleaned at the end for no reason that is actually a good reason. So that was really dumb and irritated me so frickin' much because it was like the central conflict in the story and it just wasn't explained. It would make a lot more sense if, you know, a Scythe's apprentice, if that was kind of a standardized thing and all Scythe's apprentices, you know, were gleaned if they didn't make it to the, you know, if they didn't basically get approved as a Scythe and become a full member. But because it's just them, it feels pretty dumb. The final thing that makes me feel iffy about this book is the ending. On the one hand, I did enjoy it and it did pull me out of that whole boredom of the beginning and middle section because nothing was happening and it was very dull and I didn't care about the characters. So it did pull me out of that with the excitement and flashiness of the ending. But that being said, it was building up all this political intrigue throughout the story, and then in the end it was just kind of an action-y sequence and didn't really explore the different nuances of the political intrigue that had been building up. So I felt like in that sense it didn't really fulfill its promise. Perhaps some of that will come up in later books, but the main kind of political conflict between the factions in the Scythedom were kind of left unanswered in a way. So while I do think that it redeemed the book in, you know, making it a little bit more interesting, it kind of also damned the book in killing off all of the promises that it had kind of made itself. Overall, I don't think that I would recommend this book. There are so many better dystopians out there, and it just really didn't answer the questions that I think it should have, and overall it was just kind of boring. The characters weren't great in this book at all, and I don't know, I just thought it was really mediocre with lots of aspects that were really disappointing, so this does not get Jordan's stamp of approval. Okay, the next book that I want to talk about is First They Killed My Father by Luong Ung. Now, I am a little nervous talking about this book because it feels really weird. It's a memoir about Luong's time as a child under the regime of Pol Pot in the Cambodian genocide. So it's a very dark book about true events that happened. So it feels weird me talking about it because it is something that's real and something that's personal and something that is truly horrific. So while I'm talking about this book, I think that it's important for me to emphasize that I'm looking at the actual book rather than its story in the broader sense and Luong's life. I'm not criticizing that at all, and I think that it's actually a really important story in a lot of ways. I picked this book up while I was in Cambodia a few months ago, and I read it while I was in Cambodia and finished it while I was in Vietnam, so it was interesting because I did feel like the, you know, first-person perspective and memoir perspective was impactful, but it did not impact me in the ways that a lot of the monuments and museums that I went to did. And to be honest, I'm not 100% sure why that is. While I think that it is an important story and one that I do recommend you read if you don't know anything about the Cambodian genocide, I didn't feel that emotionally attached to it. I think a lot of that is the writing style as it's written in first person, and because it is a memoir of Luong's time as a 5, 6, 7-year-old during the Cambodian genocide, it's written with very simplistic language, but that writing can sometimes seem clunky and detached. It isn't bad necessarily, but it is difficult to get into and immerse yourself into the world and really picture the events that are being described. Basically, I think it affects the pacing and the clarity. And I do think that the pacing of the book wasn't great. There were several parts that I felt were too drawn out and others that I feel like could have been elaborated on more. And again, I just want to reiterate that this is super weird for me to talk about it like this because it is a memoir and these are the things that Long experienced as she experienced it. But there's just certain elements that I felt like could have been elaborated more on or described more, and other elements that I felt, you know, dragged on too long. So as a book, it irritated me in that sense, but as a memoir, I feel weird saying that, and I don't want to like impose anything on Long because it is her experience and her recollection of those experiences. Again, all of that being said, I do think it is a really important book, and especially if you don't know much about the Cambodian genocide, which I didn't before, you know, the months leading up to my trip to Cambodia, it's a decent look at, you know, at least her perspective and some of the events that happened under the regime of Pol Pot. Again, because it is told through this first person's perspective, it's a limited look at, you know, the events that happened in the Cambodian genocide. But that being said, I do think it's a good introduction if you don't know much about it. Obviously it is a genocide though, so lots of trigger warnings for the most horrific things you can imagine a human to experience, especially a child. So go into it knowing that it's going to be extremely hard to read, it's extremely graphic, it's just devastating to think about. But, you know, it's also only a fraction of what went on and the atrocities against the Cambodian people that, you know, were experienced collectively throughout the country during that period. And finally, to finish us off on a slightly brighter note, I read Saga, Volume 1, and this is by Brian K. Vaughan and Fiona Staples. I really liked this. I rated it 4 stars, and that's because I think it's a super strong first introduction into this world and the characters. It basically follows this couple, and both of them are different kind of alien races, and their people are at war, and basically the entire galaxy is at war, either aligned with one or the other, you know, peoples or factions. And these two have fallen in love and had a child, and it's told through the perspective of the child, almost like a memoir or whatever. So the child is quite a bit older, and we know that, and the child is the narrator, and basically they're telling the story of how they were born in this volume and the first couple days of their life, which is charged with lots of action and drama because they're being chased by the prince of one of their nations and also bounty hunters from another nation. So it's wild. There's a lot going on, and it's super action-packed and fun. On top of that, I adore the art style. It's very graphic, so people who have a problem with nudity and violence and coarse language might not enjoy this, and it is definitely for an adult audience, so bear that in mind. But that being said, I really enjoy the art style. It's beautiful and really expressive, and I think that it suits the different alien races and world really well. On that note, I love the world. I think that it's super unique, and I think that just in this first one we were introduced to so much conflict that really shows the scope of the galaxy. And I'm super excited to read on. I'm ordering the next few so that I can binge them because I absolutely flew through this. You just can't stop once you sit down with it. You're just flipping through the pages until you get to the end, and I almost want to reread it to appreciate the art more because the story was so compelling that I just kind of rushed it. So I would definitely recommend this to adults. I'm also not huge into graphic novels, and this completely sucked me in. So even people who are brand new to graphic novels, I think will really enjoy this because I did. And the levels of like conflict and character and worlds being introduced is very reminiscent to me of the first episode of Avatar: The Last Airbender. It's done in such a concise way and really hooks the reader. So I don't have enough good things to say about this, and I think it's a really strong start to the series. Okay, so that is all I have for you today with this recent reads. It's my first time ever doing this, so let me know if you like this kind of thing and me kind of wrapping up some of the books that I've read that I don't necessarily have enough to say about to do like a full kind of devoted review. If you do enjoy this, leave a comment, and if you've read any of the books that I mentioned and have different thoughts or feelings or just want to chat about them, also leave a comment and I would be happy to chat with you about all of these things. If you did enjoy the video, please give it a like and subscribe to my channel. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you next time. Bye!
Je suis dans la vie comme dans mes rêves, et quand je crève, je suis le cri de qui me croit ou qui me